What happens when raw genius meets unlimited resources? When someone who's been invisible their entire life suddenly becomes the most important person in the room? This is the true story of how a 17-year-old gardener's son, working alone, in a greenhouse at 2 in the morning, caught the attention of one of the world's most powerful billionaires and changed the course of scientific innovation forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The greenhouse stood like a forgotten cathedral in the corner of the Blackstone estate, its glass panels clouded with decades of condensation and neglect. Most people saw it as nothing more than a storage space for old gardening equipment and broken pottery, a relic from an era when the mansion's previous owners had maintained elaborate botanical collections. But for Marcus Chen, this abandoned structure had become something far more precious than anyone could have imagined. A sanctuary where the impossible seemed possible, where equations danced across fogged glass and theories took shape in the silence of deep night. At 17, Marcus possessed a secret that would have astonished the world's leading physicists, if any of them had bothered to notice the quiet boy who arrived each morning with his father to tend the sprawling gardens of Victor Blackstone's Connecticut estate. While David Chen pruned roses and maintained the pristine lawns that surrounded the billionaire's mansion, his son disappeared into the greenhouse with textbooks that were older than he was, and a mind that hungered for understanding, with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The Chen family had arrived in America 12 years earlier, carrying little more than hope and David's engineering degree from Beijing University. But degrees from foreign institutions meant nothing in a job market that demanded American credentials and perfect English pronunciation. So David Chen, who had once designed bridges that spanned major rivers in China, found himself accepting a position as head gardener for a technology magnate who owned more land than some small countries and possessed resources that could fund entire university research departments. The irony was not lost on David as he worked among the perfectly manicured lawns and ornamental gardens that surrounded Victor Blackstone's estate. Here he was, maintaining the private paradise of a man who had built his fortune on technological innovation, while his own son sat alone in an abandoned greenhouse, pursuing knowledge that could rival the work being done in the world's most prestigious laboratories. The juxtaposition felt like a cruel joke that the universe was playing on their family, a reminder of how circumstances could trap brilliant minds in situations that wasted their potential. Marcus had discovered his passion for physics quite by accident during a visit to the public library when he was 12 years old. He had been searching for books about astronomy, drawn by childhood fascination with stars and planets, when he stumbled across a section devoted to theoretical physics. The books were intimidating, filled with mathematical notation that looked like a foreign language, but something about the underlying concepts captured his imagination in a way that nothing else ever had. The idea that the entire universe could be understood through mathematical relationships, that the behavior of everything from subatomic particles to galactic clusters followed predictable patterns that could be described with equations, struck Marcus as the most beautiful truth he had ever encountered. He began checking out physics textbooks with the same enthusiasm that other teenagers devoted to sports or video games, spending hours each day working through problems that challenged and expanded his understanding of how reality actually functioned. The greenhouse became his private laboratory during his 14th summer, when he realized that he needed more space and privacy than the small apartment he shared with his father could provide. The abandoned structure was far enough from the main house that he could work undisturbed, yet close enough to the gardening shed that his presence wouldn't seem unusual to anyone who might happen to notice him there. More importantly, The glass walls provided natural writing surfaces where he could sketch diagrams and work through calculations using nothing more than condensation and a piece of old chalk. What began as a convenient place to study gradually transformed into something approaching a genuine research facility, as Marcus learned to improvise equipment and experimental setups using materials he could scavenge from the estate's maintenance buildings. He built a simple spectrometer from mirrors and prisms salvaged from broken light fixtures. He constructed pendulums and oscillators from wire and weights found in the gardening supplies. He even managed to create a rudimentary particle detector using photodiodes from old security cameras and amplifier circuits he built from components ordered online with money saved from his part-time job at the local grocery store. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, but Marcus discovered that the limitations imposed by his improvised equipment actually forced him to develop a deeper understanding of the underlying physics than he might have achieved with access to professional-grade instruments. When you have to build your own tools, you must understand not just how to use them, but how they actually function at the most fundamental level. This necessity drove Marcus to explore aspects of experimental design and theoretical modeling that were typically reserved for graduate-level coursework. By his 16th birthday, Marcus was working through problems that would have challenged undergraduate physics majors at top universities. He had taught himself calculus, linear algebra, and differential equations using textbooks he borrowed from the public library and online resources that he accessed during late-night sessions. At the local community center, his notebooks filled with derivations of complex mathematical relationships, theoretical analyses of quantum mechanical systems, and speculative ideas about how established physics principles might be extended or modified to address unsolved problems. The night that changed everything began like countless others, with Marcus arriving at the greenhouse around midnight after finishing his homework and helping his father prepare for the next day's gardening tasks. He had been working for several weeks on a particularly challenging problem related to electromagnetic field interactions, trying to understand why certain configurations seemed to produce energy losses that weren't adequately explained by conventional theoretical models. The problem had emerged from his reading about wireless power transmission, a technology that held tremendous promise for applications ranging from electric vehicle charging to powering remote sensors and communication devices. The basic physics was well understood. Electromagnetic fields could transfer energy across distances without physical connections, following principles that had been established more than a century earlier by researchers like Nikola Tesla and Heinrich Hertz. But the practical implementations consistently fell short of theoretical predictions, losing efficiency through mechanisms that seemed to defy explanation. Marcus had been approaching the problem from an unusual angle, focusing not on the mathematical formalism that dominated most research papers, but on the physical intuition that had served him well in previous investigations. He tried to visualize what was actually happening when electromagnetic fields propagated through space, how they interacted with matter and other energy sources, what factors might cause them to behave differently in real-world environments than in the idealized conditions assumed by theoretical models. That night, as he worked by the light of a small LED lamp powered by a battery pack he had assembled from old laptop cells, Marcus experienced one of those moments of clarity that arrive without warning and transform understanding in ways that seem almost miraculous. He was staring at equations he had written on the greenhouse glass, mathematical relationships describing how electromagnetic fields lose coherence when they encounter certain types of matter, when he suddenly saw a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. The energy losses weren't random or purely environmental, as most researchers assumed. Instead, They followed predictable patterns related to the interaction between the transmitted electromagnetic fields and the existing electromagnetic environment through which they traveled. Every space, no matter how empty it might appear, contained electromagnetic activity from radio transmissions, cellular networks, power lines, electronic devices, and countless other sources. These background fields weren't just passive interference. They were active participants in the energy transmission process, sometimes enhancing efficiency and sometimes degrading it depending on their specific characteristics and the timing of their interactions. Marcus began writing furiously on the glass, using condensation and chalk to capture insights that were flowing faster than he could process them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mathematics that emerged was elegant and surprisingly simple, describing how energy transmission systems could be designed to adapt to their electromagnetic environment rather than fighting against it. Instead of trying to impose predetermined field patterns regardless of external conditions, successful systems would need to sense and respond to the existing electromagnetic landscape, finding ways to work with rather than against the complex energy patterns that already filled the space they were trying to use. The implications were staggering. If Marcus's insights were correct, wireless power transmission could achieve efficiency levels far beyond what conventional approaches had suggested was possible. More than that, the same principles could be applied to other electromagnetic applications, from communication systems to medical devices to industrial processes that relied on precise electromagnetic field control. Marcus worked through the night, developing and refining his theoretical framework, testing its predictions against experimental data he found in published research papers, exploring how it might be implemented in practical systems. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he had filled every available writing surface in the greenhouse with equations, diagrams, and calculations that represented a genuine breakthrough in electromagnetic field theory. But breakthrough or not, Marcus remained acutely aware that his work existed in complete isolation from the scientific community that could evaluate its significance and develop its practical applications. He was a gardener's son, working alone, in an abandoned greenhouse, with no credentials, no institutional affiliations, and no connections to the world of professional physics research. His insights, however revolutionary they might be, would remain trapped in his private notebooks unless some extraordinary circumstance brought them to the attention of people who possessed the resources and expertise to recognize their importance. That extraordinary circumstance was about to arrive in the form of Victor Blackstone himself, though Marcus had no way of knowing that the billionaire had developed a habit of taking solitary walks around his estate during sleepless nights, or that his wandering would lead him past the greenhouse just as Marcus was putting the finishing touches on equations that could revolutionize electromagnetic technology. Victor Blackstone was a man who had built his fortune on his ability to recognize potential where others saw only problems. At 53, he controlled a technology empire that spanned 6 continents and employed more than 100,000 people in industries ranging from semiconductor manufacturing to renewable energy development. His companies held patents on innovations that had transformed everything from smartphone displays to solar power systems, and his personal wealth exceeded the gross domestic product of many small nations. But wealth and success had not dulled Victor's curiosity about the fundamental questions that had driven him to study physics and engineering during his university years. He remained fascinated by the elegance of mathematical relationships that described natural phenomena, the beauty of solutions that brought order to seemingly chaotic systems, the satisfaction of discovering principles that could be applied to solve practical problems that affected millions of people. His sleeplessness on that particular night had been triggered by frustration with a research project that his company's best scientists had been struggling with for more than 18 months. Despite investing tens of millions of dollars and engaging some of the world's leading experts in electromagnetic theory, they had been unable to develop wireless power transmission systems that achieved the efficiency levels required for commercial viability. The mathematical models suggested that much higher performance should be possible, but experimental results consistently fell short of theoretical predictions in ways that defied explanation. Victor's walk that night took him along a path that wound through the formal gardens behind his mansion, past the tennis court and swimming pool, toward the more naturalistic landscaping that bordered the estate's outer boundaries. The route was one he had traveled countless times during previous episodes of middle-of-the-night restlessness. But tonight, something was different. Light was visible through the windows of the old greenhouse, a soft glow that shouldn't have been there at 2 o'clock in the morning. His first assumption was that someone had left a security light on, or perhaps that one of the gardening staff was dealing with some kind of emergency that required nighttime attention. But as he approached the structure, Victor could see that the light was moving, shifting position in ways that suggested human activity rather than a forgotten fixture. Curious now, rather than merely concerned, he moved closer, trying to understand what might be happening in a building that was supposed to be used only for storage. What Victor saw when he peered through the greenhouse windows would have seemed impossible if he hadn't witnessed it with his own eyes. A young man, barely out of his teens, was working systematically across the glass walls of the structure, writing equations with chalk and condensed water vapor, covering every available surface with mathematical notation that was clearly sophisticated and purposeful rather than random or decorative. Victor had spent enough years around advanced research to recognize genuine theoretical work when he saw it, and what covered the greenhouse walls was unmistakably the product of serious mathematical thinking. The equations dealt with electromagnetic field theory, exploring relationships between energy transmission, environmental interference, and adaptive system responses that directly addressed the problems his own research teams had been struggling to solve. But what astonished Victor more than the sophistication of the mathematics was the identity of the person creating it. Marcus Chen was someone he had seen around the estate for years, the quiet son of the head gardener, a boy who helped with routine maintenance tasks and seemed to blend into the background of daily operations. The idea that this unassuming teenager might possess advanced knowledge of theoretical physics seemed so improbable that Victor's initial impulse was to assume he was witnessing some kind of elaborate prank or misunderstanding. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The young man working in the greenhouse wasn't copying equations from a textbook or following a predetermined set of instructions. He was thinking, creating, developing new mathematical relationships in real time as Victor watched. The fluid way he moved from one section of wall to another, the confident manner in which he modified and refined his expressions, the evident pleasure he took in discovering elegant solutions to complex problems, all of this indicated genuine expertise rather than mere imitation. Victor stood outside the greenhouse for more than an hour, watching Marcus work and trying to understand the implications of what he was witnessing. Here was someone who had clearly developed advanced knowledge of physics through independent study, someone who was pursuing cutting-edge theoretical research in complete isolation from the academic and corporate institutions that normally supported such work. The sheer improbability of the situation made it difficult to process, but the quality of the work itself was undeniable. When Marcus finally noticed the figure standing outside the greenhouse windows, his first reaction was panic. He had been so absorbed in his work that he had lost track of time and surroundings, forgetting that his late-night research sessions were supposed to remain secret. Being discovered by anyone would have been problematic, but being discovered by Victor Blackstone himself was potentially catastrophic. The billionaire had the power to fire Marcus's father, to evict them from their small apartment, to destroy the quiet life they had built on the margins of his vast estate. But Victor's expression wasn't angry or suspicious. Instead, he looked curious, even impressed, as he studied the equations that covered the greenhouse walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried genuine interest rather than accusation or alarm. "That's quite remarkable work," Victor said, stepping into the greenhouse and examining the mathematical relationships more closely. "Where did you learn electromagnetic field theory?" Marcus swallowed hard, trying to find words that could adequately explain his situation without sounding presumptuous or dishonest. "I taught myself, sir, from books mostly, and online resources when I could access them." Victor nodded slowly, still studying the equations with the focused attention of someone who understood their significance. "These calculations address wireless power transmission efficiency, don't they? You're exploring how electromagnetic fields interact with environmental conditions." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to understand why practical systems don't achieve the performance that theoretical models predict they should." Victor turned to look at Marcus directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "And what conclusions have you reached?" Marcus hesitated, uncertain whether he should attempt to explain insights that had taken him months to develop to someone who might dismiss them as the amateur speculations of an untrained teenager. But Victor's demeanor suggested genuine interest rather than polite skepticism. So Marcus began to describe his theoretical framework, starting with basic principles and building toward the more sophisticated concepts he had been exploring. As Marcus spoke, Victor's expression evolved from curiosity to amazement to something approaching awe. The young man wasn't simply reciting information he had memorized from textbooks. He was presenting original insights that addressed fundamental problems in electromagnetic theory, ideas that could potentially revolutionize wireless power transmission, and numerous other applications that depended on precise electromagnetic field control. "Marcus," Victor said when the explanation was complete, "do you realize what you've accomplished here? These insights could solve problems that my company's research teams have been struggling with for years. You've identified relationships that have eluded some of the brightest minds in physics." Marcus looked down at his hands, still chalky from writing on the glass walls. "I don't know if any of it is correct, sir. I don't have access to the kind of equipment that would be needed to test these ideas properly." Victor smiled, recognizing both the intellectual humility and the implicit hunger for resources that could transform theoretical insights into practical applications. "What if I told you that such equipment exists and that I might be able to provide access to it?" The conversation that followed would later be remembered as the moment when Marcus Chen's life pivoted from one trajectory to another, when a young man who had been invisible to the world suddenly found himself at the center of attention from one of its most powerful figures. Victor's offer to provide resources and opportunities was generous beyond anything Marcus could have imagined, but it also represented the beginning of challenges and choices that would test not just his intellectual abilities, but his character and values in ways he was only beginning to understand. As dawn broke over the Blackstone estate, illuminating the greenhouse where equations still covered every available surface, Marcus stood at the threshold of a future that was both thrilling and terrifying in its possibilities. The quiet life he had known was ending, replaced by opportunities that could transform not just his own circumstances, but potentially the lives of countless others who might benefit from the innovations his insights could enable. The question that remained was whether a 17-year-old gardener's son was ready for the responsibilities and complexities that came with having his genius finally recognized by someone who possessed the power to change the world. The mahogany. Doors of Blackstone Industries' executive boardroom had witnessed countless meetings that shaped global markets, but never one quite like this. Victor Blackstone sat at the head of the polished conference table, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the wood as he studied the young man seated across from him. Marcus Chen hadn't spoken since entering the room 20 minutes ago, his eyes fixed on the whiteboard that dominated the far wall. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, neither man willing to break it first. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline glittered in the late afternoon sun, but Victor's attention remained laser-focused on the gardener's son, who had somehow managed to solve theoretical physics equations while hiding in a greenhouse at 2 in the morning. Marcus wore the same clothes from the night before, his work boots still carrying traces of soil, his flannel shirt, wrinkled from sleep he hadn't gotten. He looked impossibly young, sitting in the leather chair that had hosted Nobel laureates and cabinet ministers. But there was something in his posture that spoke of quiet determination rather than intimidation. Victor finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, Marcus, about what I witnessed in that greenhouse." He paused, watching for any reaction in the young man's expression. "I've built my fortune on recognizing potential where others see only limitations, but I've never encountered anything quite like what you showed me." Marcus shifted slightly, in his chair, his calloused hands folding in his lap. "I wasn't trying to show you anything, Mr. Blackstone. I was just working through a problem that had been bothering me." His voice carried the same steady quality it had possessed in the darkness of the greenhouse, neither apologetic nor boastful, simply honest. The billionaire leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes narrowing with interest. "That problem you were working through, Marcus, it wasn't from some undergraduate textbook. The equations I saw on that condensation-covered glass, they were addressing quantum field theory applications that most PhD candidates would struggle to comprehend, let alone manipulate." He stood, walking to the whiteboard with the fluid motion of someone comfortable in positions of authority. "I've made it my business to understand the cutting edge of scientific research. I fund laboratories, sponsor conferences, sit on advisory boards. What you were doing last night shouldn't be possible without years of formal education and access to resources you've never had." Marcus watched as Victor picked up a marker and began writing on the whiteboard. The equations that appeared were complex, dense with mathematical notation that seemed to dance across the pristine surface. They were different from what Marcus had been working on in the greenhouse, but related, connected by underlying principles that he could see as clearly as the veins in a leaf. "These equations," Victor said, stepping back from the board, "represent the foundation of a new energy storage technology my research division has been developing for the past 3 years. We've invested $47 million and engaged 12 of the world's leading theoretical physicists. Despite all that investment and expertise, we've hit a wall. The efficiency curve plateaus at 73%, and we cannot determine why." Marcus stared at the whiteboard, his mind automatically beginning to parse the relationships between the variables, to trace the logical flow from one expression to the next. He could see the elegance in the work, the sophisticated thinking that had gone into crafting these equations, but he could also see something else. A subtle asymmetry in the way the boundary conditions were defined, a small but critical oversight that was causing the entire system to lose coherence at higher energy densities. Victor returned to his seat, his gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to listen carefully before you respond. I believe you have a gift something that transcends traditional education or conventional intelligence. I've seen brilliant minds work on problems for months without achieving breakthroughs that you seem to grasp intuitively in moments. The young man's attention remained fixed on the whiteboard, his eyes moving systematically from equation to equation, as if reading a story written in mathematical language. Victor continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. My company operates 14 research facilities across 6 countries. We employ some of the brightest minds in physics, chemistry, and engineering. But brilliance without opportunity is like having a Ferrari with no roads to drive it on. I want to give you those roads, Marcus. Marcus finally looked away from the whiteboard, meeting Victor's gaze directly. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackstone? The billionaire smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. I'm proposing that we test the full extent of your capabilities, not through traditional academic assessments or standardized examinations, but through real problems that have real consequences. I want to see what happens when that mind of yours is given access to proper tools, proper resources, proper challenges. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a sleek tablet, its surface reflecting the overhead lights as he placed it on the table between them. This device contains access to our entire research database. Every experiment, every theoretical model, every failed attempt and successful breakthrough we've achieved over the past decade. I'm giving you complete access to information that we normally reserve for our senior research staff. Marcus stared at the tablet as if it was some kind of alien artifact. In the small apartment he shared with his father above the flower shop, their ancient laptop took 5 minutes to load a simple web page. The idea of having instant access to cutting-edge research data seemed almost fantastical. Victor continued, his voice gaining momentum as he outlined his vision. More than that, I'm offering you laboratory access, real equipment, not jury-rigged apparatus made from gardening supplies and hope. Spectroscopy machines, particle accelerators, quantum computers, anything you need to test your theories and push the boundaries of what we currently understand. The offer hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and transformative, but somehow insubstantial. Marcus felt the weight of possibility pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. He thought of his father, probably at that very moment tending to the roses in the Blackstone gardens, unaware that his son was sitting in a boardroom receiving an offer that could change everything. Why? Marcus asked, the single word containing multitudes of unspoken questions. Why would you do this for someone like me? You don't know anything about me beyond what you saw last night. Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming thoughtful. You're right that I don't know your full story, Marcus, but I know enough. I know that you taught yourself advanced physics using textbooks that were decades old and equipment that belonged in a museum. I know that you solved problems last night that have been puzzling experts for years. Most importantly, I know that you did all of this not because someone told you to, not because you were chasing grades or accolades, but because you were genuinely curious about how the universe works. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window where the city sprawled endlessly, toward the horizon. 35 years ago, I was in a position not entirely unlike yours. Not poor, not struggling in the same way, but limited by circumstances beyond my control. Someone took a chance on me then, invested in potential rather than proven track record. That investment changed not just my life, but the lives of thousands of people who now work for companies I've built, use technologies I've funded, benefit from foundations I've established. Marcus absorbed this information silently, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. He had spent so many nights in the greenhouse, working through equations by lamplight, wondering if his solitary pursuit of knowledge would ever amount to anything meaningful. The possibility that it might actually lead somewhere seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Victor stood again, this time walking to one of the windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, Marcus. What I'm asking is that you allow me to set up a proper test. Give me 1 week to prepare a challenge worthy of your abilities. If you can demonstrate that what I witnessed last night wasn't a fluke, if you can show me that your insights are genuinely revolutionary rather than simply impressive, then we'll discuss a more formal arrangement." The billionaire turned back toward Marcus, his expression serious but not intimidating. "During that week, you'll have access to everything I mentioned: the research database, laboratory equipment, consultation with our senior staff. If you choose to take advantage of it, work on whatever interests you most, follow whatever questions intrigue you. At the end of the week, we'll review what you've accomplished and decide together whether this partnership makes sense for both of us." Marcus felt his pulse quickening as the implications of the offer became clear. A week with access to resources he had only dreamed of, the opportunity to explore ideas that had been confined to his imagination due to lack of proper equipment and data. It was like being offered the chance to see color after a lifetime of black and white vision. But beneath the excitement, other emotions stirred. Uncertainty about whether he could live up to Victor's expectations. Worry about his father, who depended on him for both companionship and assistance, with the increasingly demanding physical work of maintaining the extensive gardens. Fear that he might be stepping into a world where he didn't belong, where his lack of formal education and social polish would eventually expose him as an imposter. "There's one condition," Victor said, as if reading the hesitation in Marcus's expression. "This arrangement must remain confidential for now. I have competitors who would be very interested to know that I'm investing resources in unconventional research approaches. More importantly, if this experiment doesn't work out as we hope, I don't want you to suffer any negative consequences. Your father's position is secure, regardless of what happens between us. This is purely about exploring your potential, not about creating obligations or dependencies." Marcus nodded slowly, appreciating both the practical wisdom and the underlying kindness of this stipulation. Victor Blackstone had built his reputation on being shrewd and occasionally ruthless in business dealings, but there was something genuinely protective in his approach to this unusual situation. "I need to discuss this with my father," Marcus said finally. "He's been my only advisor my entire life. I can't make a decision this significant without his input." Victor smiled, the expression reaching his eyes for the first time since Marcus had entered the boardroom. "I would have been disappointed if you'd said anything else. A man who makes major life decisions without consulting the people who matter most to him isn't the kind of person I want to work with." He returned to his seat, reaching into his jacket again to withdraw a business card. "Take your time. When you're ready to discuss this further, call the number on this card. It goes directly to my personal assistant, not through our main switchboard." And Marcus accepted the card, noting the weight of the paper stock and the subtle elegance of the embossed lettering. Even this small detail spoke to a world of resources and attention to quality that was foreign to his experience. "There's one more thing," Victor said as Marcus prepared to leave. "The equations on that whiteboard, the ones our research team has been struggling with. You were studying them while we talked. Did you notice anything unusual about them?" Marcus paused. At the door, his hand resting on the polished brass handle, he looked back at the whiteboard, his mind automatically reviewing the mathematical relationships he had been analyzing throughout their conversation. "The boundary conditions," he said quietly. "They're defined correctly for a closed system, but you're trying to apply them to an open system. The energy dissipation terms need to include thermal coupling factors that account for environmental interaction. That's why your efficiency curve plateaus. The system is losing coherence through pathways that aren't represented in your model. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then walked to the whiteboard and began making rapid calculations in the margin. The modifications Marcus had suggested were elegant in their simplicity, addressing the fundamental issue without requiring massive revisions to the underlying theoretical framework. After several minutes of computation, Victor set down the marker and turned back toward Marcus with an expression of amazement. "Do you realize what you just did?" he asked. "You identified and solved a problem that has cost us months of research, time and millions of dollars in failed experiments, and you did it while we were having a conversation about something entirely different." Marcus shrugged, genuinely puzzled by Victor's reaction. "The pattern was obvious once I saw how the equations were structured. It's like seeing a leak in a pipe. Once you notice where the water is escaping, fixing it becomes straightforward." The billionaire shook his head slowly, as if trying to process something that defied conventional understanding. "Marcus, what you just demonstrated isn't normal. It's not even exceptional in the usual sense. It's something entirely different, something I'm not sure I have adequate words to describe." As Marcus left the Blackstone Industries building and made his way back through the city toward home, he carried with him not just the memory of an extraordinary offer, but the beginning of a recognition that his relationship with mathematical and physical concepts might indeed be something unique. The casual way he had spotted the flaw in the energy storage equations, the intuitive understanding that seemed to bypass the usual analytical processes, these were not skills he had consciously developed or attributes he had considered particularly remarkable. The subway ride back to Queens gave him time to think, to process the magnitude of the opportunity Victor Blackstone had presented. Around him, the evening commuters buried themselves in smartphones and newspapers, each absorbed in their own private worlds of concern and ambition. Marcus found himself wondering how many other people were carrying unexplored potential, dreams deferred by circumstance, talents that would never be recognized or developed because the right opportunity never materialized. When he finally arrived at the small apartment above Chen's Flowers, he found his father preparing dinner in the cramped kitchen, his movements economical and practiced, after decades of making do with limited space and resources. David Chen looked up as his son entered, noting immediately the unusual expression on Marcus's face. "You look like someone who has seen something remarkable," David said in Mandarin, setting aside the vegetables he'd been chopping. "Was your day at the library productive?" Marcus had told his father he was going to spend the day at the public library, working on some theoretical problems that had been occupying his thoughts. It was essentially true, though incomplete in ways that suddenly felt significant. He sat down at the small table that served as both workspace and dining area, trying to find words that could adequately convey what had transpired. "Ba," he said, using the familiar term of address. "Something unexpected has happened. Something that might change our circumstances considerably." David Chen had learned long ago to read the subtle variations in his son's tone and expression. The young man before him carried the same thoughtful intensity that had characterized him since childhood, but there was something new as well, an energy, a sense of possibility that hadn't been present that morning. Marcus spent the next hour recounting his encounter with Victor Blackstone, being careful to include every significant detail while maintaining the confidentiality that had been requested. He described the equations on the greenhouse glass, the conversation in the boardroom, the offer of resources and opportunity that seemed almost too generous to be real. David listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded on the table, his expression revealing nothing of his internal response to this extraordinary narrative. When Marcus finally finished speaking, Silence settled over the small kitchen like evening shadows. "This man, this Mr. Blackstone," David said eventually, "he is offering you access to opportunities that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of your life. But he is also asking you to enter a world where you have no established relationships, no familiar reference points, no certainty about how your unique gifts will be received or utilized." Marcus nodded, appreciating his father's ability to identify the essential elements of any complex situation. This analytical clarity was something David had developed during his years as an engineer in China, before circumstances had forced him to rebuild his life in America as a gardener and small business owner. "The question," David continued, "is not whether you are capable of succeeding in such an environment. Your intellectual abilities have been evident since you were young enough to climb onto chairs, to reach books on high shelves. The question is whether this opportunity aligns with your deeper purposes, with the kind of person you want to become, and the kind of contribution you want to make to the world." The older man stood and moved to the window that overlooked the small garden behind their building. Even in this modest space, he had managed to create something beautiful, a carefully arranged collection of plants that provided both aesthetic pleasure and practical benefit. "When I was your age, I believed that success meant achieving recognition for my technical skills, earning respect from colleagues who shared my professional interests. I pursued advanced degrees, competed for prestigious positions, measured my worth by external standards of accomplishment." He turned back toward his son, his expression gentle but serious. "Those pursuits were not wrong, but they were incomplete. I discovered that the most meaningful work often happens in quiet spaces, with people who may never achieve fame or fortune, but whose lives are improved by your efforts. The satisfaction I find in helping Mrs. Rodriguez grow tomatoes that remind her of her childhood in Puerto Rico, or in teaching neighborhood children to identify birds by their songs. These experiences have proven more fulfilling than any research paper I ever published." Marcus absorbed his father's words, understanding that this was not advice against accepting Victor's offer, but rather guidance about maintaining perspective regardless of which path he chose. David Chen had always emphasized the importance of internal compass over external validation, of contributing meaningfully rather than merely succeeding conspicuously. "Tell me what draws you to this opportunity," David said, returning to his seat at the table. "Beyond the obvious attractions of better equipment and access to information, what appeals to you about working with Mr. Blackstone?" Marcus considered the question carefully, trying to separate genuine motivation from the intoxicating excitement of being recognized and valued. "I think it's the possibility of working on problems that matter," he said slowly. "All those equations I've been solving in the greenhouse, they're interesting as intellectual exercises, but they don't connect to anything real. Mr. Blackstone is offering the chance to apply theoretical understanding to practical challenges, to see whether the patterns I recognize in mathematics can actually help solve problems that affect people's lives." David nodded approvingly. "That motivation seems worthy of serious consideration, but I would encourage you to think also about longer-term implications. If you prove successful in this initial test, if Mr. Blackstone decides to offer you more permanent opportunities, what kind of commitments might that involve? What obligations would you be accepting? What freedoms might you be surrendering?" These were sobering questions, ones that Marcus realized he had not fully considered during the excitement of the afternoon. Working with Victor Blackstone would likely mean entering into contractual relationships, accepting responsibilities to shareholders and stakeholders, operating within corporate structures that prioritize profit and competitive advantage. The Your pursuit of knowledge that had characterized his solitary work in the greenhouse might become complicated by commercial considerations and political dynamics. There's another aspect to consider, David continued. This opportunity comes to you not through your own efforts to seek it out, but because of an accidental encounter. Mr. Blackstone discovered your abilities by chance while you were engaged in private study that you never intended anyone to witness. This suggests that you have been pursuing knowledge for its own sake, driven by genuine curiosity rather than external rewards. He paused, allowing this observation to settle before continuing. If you accept this offer, you will be transitioning from learning that is entirely self-directed to learning that serves someone else's objectives. That transition is not inherently problematic, but it is significant. It changes the fundamental nature of your relationship with knowledge and discovery. Marcus felt a chill of recognition as his father articulated concerns that had been lurking at the edges of his consciousness throughout the day. The freedom to explore whatever questions interested him most, to follow intellectual curiosity wherever it led, without regard for practical applications or commercial potential, had been one of the most cherished aspects of his solitary studies. Working with Victor Blackstone might provide access to better tools and more complete information, but it would also introduce external expectations and predetermined objectives. On the other hand, David said, his tone becoming more encouraging, isolation has its own limitations. The work you do alone in the greenhouse, however sophisticated, remains theoretical until it is tested against reality and subjected to evaluation by others who understand its significance. Mr. Blackstone is offering you the opportunity to move from theory to application, from solitary exploration to collaborative development. The two men continued their discussion late into the evening, exploring the implications and possibilities from multiple angles. David shared stories from his own career transitions, describing the challenges and rewards of adapting his skills to new environments and expectations. Marcus described in greater detail his analysis of the energy storage equations, walking his father through the logical process that had led him to identify the efficiency problem. As the night deepened, a decision began to emerge naturally from their conversation, not a dramatic commitment, but a willingness to explore the opportunity that Victor had presented while maintaining awareness of both its potential benefits and inherent risks. "I think," Marcus said finally, "that I should accept Mr. Blackstone's offer for the 1-week trial period. It will give me a chance to experience working with professional-grade equipment and access to comprehensive research data. More importantly, it will help me understand whether my abilities are actually as unusual as he suggests, or whether I've simply been working in isolation for so long that I've lost perspective on what constitutes normal intellectual capacity." David smiled, pleased with both the decision and the reasoning behind it. "That approach seems both prudent and adventurous. You will gain valuable information about your own capabilities and about the world of professional research, while maintaining the option to return to your current path if the collaboration doesn't develop as hoped." They spent a few more minutes discussing practical details. Marcus would need to arrange his schedule to accommodate the time he would be spending at Blackstone Industries' research facilities. David would need to handle the garden maintenance responsibilities alone during that period, though he assured his son that the current season's workload was manageable for one person. As they prepared for bed, David offered one final observation. "Remember, Marcus, that your value as a person is not determined by your intellectual abilities, however remarkable they may be. You are worthy of respect and consideration regardless of whether you can solve complex equations or identify innovative solutions to technical problems. Mr. Blackstone's recognition of your talents is gratifying, but it should not become the foundation of your self-worth." Marcus nodded, understanding that his father was offering protection against the psychological pitfalls that could accompany sudden recognition and opportunity. The temptation to define himself primarily through his intellectual gifts, to seek validation through increasingly impressive demonstrations of mental capability, was something that could ultimately distort his relationship with both learning and other people. The next morning, Marcus called the number on Victor Blackstone's business card. The conversation was brief and professional. He accepted the offer for the one-week trial period, and arrangements were made for him to begin the following Monday at the company's primary research facility in Manhattan. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Marcus spent hours reviewing his notebooks, organizing his thoughts about various theoretical problems he wanted to explore, given access to proper equipment and data. He also helped his father with garden maintenance tasks, aware that this might be one of the last weekends when such work would constitute his primary responsibility. On Sunday evening, as he prepared for what might prove to be a transformative week, Marcus found himself returning to the greenhouse where Victor Blackstone had first discovered him, working through equations on condensation-covered glass. He stood in the same spot where he had been writing just days earlier, but the space felt different now, still peaceful, still conducive to contemplation, but no longer isolated from the larger world of scientific inquiry and application. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a single equation on the glass, not a complex theoretical construct, but something simple and fundamental. The basic relationship between energy and mass that Einstein had formulated more than a century earlier, E equals mc squared, the foundation upon which so much of modern physics had been built. Tomorrow, he would begin exploring how that fundamental relationship could be applied to solve contemporary problems, how theoretical understanding could be transformed into practical benefit. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of the greenhouse, he simply stood in contemplation of the elegant simplicity that underlies all the complexity of the physical universe. The equation glowed softly in the lamplight, a bridge between the world he had known and the world he was about to enter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities for both success and failure. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle presence of growing plants and the familiar comfort of mathematical truth, Marcus Chen felt ready to discover just how far his unique gifts might take him. The elevator ascended 43 floors in silence, its polished steel doors reflecting Marcus's nervous energy back at him in fractured glimpses. Monday morning at Blackstone Industries carried a different weight than any Monday he had ever experienced. Instead of preparing for another day of routine garden maintenance, he was about to enter one of the most advanced research facilities in the world. Armed with nothing but his unconventional understanding of physics and a burning curiosity that had sustained him through years of solitary study. Dr. Sarah Martinez was waiting when the elevator doors opened onto the research floor. She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of professional competence that immediately commanded respect. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but reserved, the greeting of someone who had been briefed about this unusual situation but remained skeptical about its potential outcomes. "Mr. Chen, welcome to Blackstone Advanced Research," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish as her first language. "Mr. Blackstone has asked me to serve as your liaison during this trial period. I'm the Deputy Director of our Theoretical Physics Division, and I'll be helping you navigate our systems and protocols." Marcus followed her through corridors lined with laboratories that looked like something from a science fiction film. Through reinforced glass windows, he glimpsed equipment that represented millions of dollars of investment, machines whose purposes he could only guess at despite his extensive theoretical knowledge. Researchers in white coats moved purposefully between workstations, their conversations filled with technical terminology that floated past him like fragments of an exotic language he was still learning to speak fluently. "I should be transparent with you from the beginning," Dr. Martinez said as they walked. "Most of our staff are unaware of your background or the circumstances that brought you here. As far as they know, you're a consulting researcher who will be working on some special projects. Mr. Blackstone felt this approach would allow you to focus on your work without dealing with unnecessary scrutiny or skepticism." She paused beside a door marked with biometric scanners and digital displays. "Your access credentials will allow you into most areas of the facility, though some of our more sensitive projects remain restricted until further notice. The laboratory space we've prepared for you includes access to our computational cluster, spectrometry equipment, and a fabrication workshop where you can build prototypes if your theoretical work leads in that direction." The laboratory that Dr. Martinez showed him was larger than the entire apartment he shared with his father. Sleek workbenches lined the walls, each equipped with high-resolution monitors and input devices that responded to touch, gesture, and voice commands. In one corner stood a quantum computer, its cooling systems humming quietly as they maintained the near-absolute zero temperatures required for quantum coherence. Along the far wall, a series of 3D printers and precision manufacturing tools waited to transform digital designs into physical reality. "This is overwhelming," Marcus admitted, running his hand along one of the pristine workbenches. "I'm accustomed to working with pencil and paper, occasionally a basic calculator. I'm not sure I know how to make effective use of all this equipment." Dr. Martinez's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional facade. "Mr. Blackstone mentioned that you've been working largely in isolation, developing your understanding through self-directed study. That's actually quite remarkable, given the sophistication of the work he described. But you're right that there will be a learning curve as you adapt to working with modern research tools." She walked to one of the computer terminals and began demonstrating the interface. "These systems are designed to be intuitive, but they're also incredibly powerful. You can run simulations that would have taken months of calculation just a few years ago. You can model complex systems, test theoretical predictions, and iterate through multiple variations of an idea in a matter of hours rather than years." Marcus watched as equations appeared on the screen in response to Dr. Martinez's inputs. The mathematical relationships he had been manipulating in his mind now rendered in crisp digital precision. The software could handle symbolic manipulation, numerical analysis, and graphical representation simultaneously, offering multiple perspectives on the same underlying concepts. "The real advantage," she continued, "is that these tools can help you test ideas that would be impossible to explore through pure theoretical work. You can see how your mathematical models behave under different conditions, identify edge cases that might not be obvious from the equations alone, and validate your insights against experimental data from similar systems." Over the next several hours, Dr. Martinez walked Marcus through the various systems and resources available to him. The research database contained petabytes of information, everything from historical scientific papers to real-time feeds from experimental facilities around the world. The computational resources could simulate physical systems at scales ranging from subatomic particles to galactic structures. The fabrication equipment could produce prototypes with precision measured in nanometers. But as impressive as these resources were, Marcus found himself most intrigued by something much simpler, a basic whiteboard that occupied one wall of the laboratory. Despite all the advanced technology surrounding him, The familiar surface for writing and erasing equations felt like an anchor to the methods that had served him well during his years of independent study. "I see you've noticed our most low-tech feature," Dr. Martinez said with a slight smile. "Mr. Blackstone specifically requested that we include traditional writing surfaces. He mentioned that you seem to think most clearly when working with chalk or markers rather than digital interfaces." Marcus nodded, already envisioning how he might use the whiteboard to sketch out ideas before translating them into the more formal digital representations required by the computer systems. There was something about the physical act of writing, the tactile feedback of marker against surface, that seemed to facilitate the kind of intuitive leaps that characterized his best theoretical work. "Before I leave you to begin exploring," Dr. Martinez said, "Mr. Blackstone asked me to present you with a specific challenge, something concrete to work on during your first few days here, to help you get acclimated to the environment while also giving us insight into your problem-solving approach." She walked to her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder filled with technical documents, graphs, and experimental data. "This contains information about a project we've been struggling with for the better part of 2 years. We're trying to develop a new approach to energy transmission that could revolutionize how power is distributed across large geographical areas. The theoretical foundation seems sound, but we keep encountering efficiency losses that we can't adequately explain or eliminate." Marcus accepted the folder, feeling the weight of the accumulated research it contained. "What kind of efficiency losses are you seeing?" "That's part of the mystery," Dr. Martinez replied. "The losses vary depending on environmental conditions, transmission distances, and power loads in ways that don't match our theoretical predictions. Sometimes the system performs exactly as expected. Other times it loses more than 30% of its input energy through mechanisms we can't identify." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Marcus. "I should mention that this project has significant commercial implications. If we can solve the efficiency problem, we're looking at a technology that could reduce energy costs for millions of people, while also making renewable power sources much more practical for widespread deployment. On the other hand, our investors are getting impatient with the lack of progress, and there's talk of discontinuing the research if we don't achieve a breakthrough soon." After Dr. Martinez left, Marcus found himself alone in the laboratory, with resources beyond anything he had ever imagined, and a challenge that carried real-world consequences for both the company and potentially millions of energy consumers. He sat at one of the workbenches and opened the folder, beginning to read through the accumulated research with the systematic approach he had developed during years of working through complex problems without guidance or support. The energy transmission system described in the documents was elegant in concept, using principles of electromagnetic field manipulation to transfer power across distances without the need for traditional conducting cables. The theoretical work was sophisticated, clearly the product of brilliant minds working with substantial resources. But as Marcus read through the experimental results, he began to see patterns that the original researchers had apparently missed. The efficiency losses weren't random or purely environmental, as the report suggested. Instead, they seemed to correlate with specific configurations of the electromagnetic fields, particularly in situations where the transmission path passed, near certain types of geological formations or structures containing ferromagnetic materials. The losses were most pronounced when the system operated at power levels that created field strengths approaching critical thresholds that weren't explicitly defined in the theoretical models. Marcus walked to the whiteboard and began sketching the mathematical relationships he was seeing in the data. Unlike the formal equations presented in the research documents, his approach was more intuitive, focusing on the underlying physical principles rather than the complex mathematical formalism. that had been layered on top of them. He drew electromagnetic field lines, illustrated how they would interact with different types of matter, and mapped out the energy pathways that would result from various system configurations. As the morning progressed, a picture began to emerge on the whiteboard that was significantly different from the models presented in the official research. Marcus realized that the original team had been treating the transmission medium, the space through which the electromagnetic fields traveled, as essentially empty. But space is never truly empty, especially near the Earth's surface, where the transmission system would operate. The presence of water vapor, suspended particles, variations in atmospheric density, and countless other factors created a complex and constantly changing environment that could dramatically affect electromagnetic field propagation. More importantly, the research team had been thinking about their system in isolation, as if it were the only source of electromagnetic activity in its operating environment. But modern environments are saturated with electromagnetic fields from radio transmissions, cellular networks, power lines, electronic devices, and countless other sources. The energy transmission system wasn't operating in a laboratory vacuum, but in a complex electromagnetic ecosystem where its fields would interact with existing energy patterns in ways that could cause unexpected losses and inefficiencies. Marcus spent the rest of the morning developing a modified theoretical framework that accounted for these environmental interactions. Instead of treating electromagnetic field propagation as a simple linear relationship between input and output, his approach modeled it as a dynamic system where energy could be temporarily stored, redirected, or converted into other forms depending on the specific conditions encountered along the transmission path. By lunchtime, he had filled most of the whiteboard with equations, diagrams, and calculations that presented a fundamentally different understanding of why the energy transmission system was experiencing efficiency losses. According to his analysis, the losses weren't bugs in the system, but rather predictable consequences of operating in a complex electromagnetic environment without adequate compensation for external field interactions. Dr. Martinez returned in the early afternoon to check on his progress. She found Marcus standing before the whiteboard, marker in hand, staring at the mathematical relationships he had been developing throughout the morning. The expressions covering the white surface looked nothing like the formal equations she was accustomed to seeing in research presentations, but there was something compelling about their organization and flow that suggested deep understanding, rather than amateur speculation. "How has your first morning gone?" she asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee she had brought from the facility's cafeteria. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing that he had been so absorbed in his work that he had forgotten to eat or drink anything since arriving at the laboratory. "I think I may have identified the source of your efficiency problems," he said, gesturing toward the whiteboard, "but my conclusions suggest that the issues are more fundamental than your research reports indicated." Dr. Martinez studied the whiteboard carefully, her expression growing increasingly intense as she began to understand the implications of what Marcus had developed. His approach was unconventional, bypassing much of the mathematical formalism that characterized professional physics research in favor of more direct engagement with the underlying physical principles. But the logic was clear, and the conclusions seemed to follow inevitably from the premises he had established. "You're suggesting that our transmission system is essentially fighting against the existing electromagnetic environment," she said slowly. "That we're trying to impose our own field patterns without accounting for the energy signatures that are already present in the space we're trying to use." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, pleased that she was grasping the essential insight. "Exactly. It's like trying to have a conversation in a noisy room without adjusting your voice or timing to accommodate the background sound." Your message gets distorted or lost, not because there's anything wrong with what you're trying to communicate, but because you're not adapting to the communication environment. He pointed to one section of the whiteboard where he had sketched overlapping wave patterns. These diagrams show what happens when your transmission fields encounter other electromagnetic sources. Sometimes they reinforce each other, creating efficiency gains that exceed your theoretical predictions. Other times, they interfere destructively, causing the energy losses you've been measuring. The pattern depends on the specific field configurations present at any given moment. Dr. Martinez stared at the whiteboard for several minutes, working through the mathematical relationships Marcus had presented. Her background in theoretical physics was extensive, but his approach was so different from conventional research methods that it took time for her to fully appreciate what he was proposing. If you're correct, she said finally, then solving the efficiency problem isn't just a matter of refining our existing system. It would require developing real-time adaptive capabilities that could adjust field parameters based on environmental conditions and external electromagnetic activity. That's right, Marcus replied. But it's not as complicated as it might sound. The environmental electromagnetic patterns aren't random. They follow predictable cycles based on factors like time of day, weather conditions, and human activity. In patterns, a sufficiently sophisticated control system could learn to anticipate these patterns and adjust the transmission parameters accordingly. He walked to one of the computer terminals and began translating his whiteboard equations into the digital modeling environment. Let me show you what this would look like in practice. Over the next several hours, Marcus worked with Dr. Martinez to build a computational model that incorporated his insights about electromagnetic environmental interactions. The software allowed them to simulate energy transmission under various conditions, testing how the system would perform when surrounded by different types and intensities of external electromagnetic activity. The results were remarkable. When the transmission system was modeled using Marcus's adaptive approach, the efficiency losses that had plagued the original research virtually disappeared. More than that, the system actually became more efficient than the original theoretical predictions had suggested, because it was able to take advantage of favorable environmental conditions to enhance energy transfer rather than simply avoiding unfavorable ones. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Martinez said as they reviewed the simulation results. "If these projections are accurate, you've not only solved our efficiency problem, you've potentially improved the system's performance beyond what we thought was theoretically possible." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything he had experienced during his years of solitary theoretical work. Seeing his ideas translated into practical applications, observing how abstract mathematical relationships could predict and improve real-world system performance, validated the countless hours he had spent working through equations in the greenhouse. By lamplight, there's still a lot of work to be done, he cautioned. These are just simulations based on theoretical models. We'd need to build prototypes, conduct real-world testing, and refine the control systems based on experimental data. But the fundamental approach seems sound. Dr. Martinez was already making notes about the next steps that would be required to move from theoretical insight to practical implementation. Mr. Blackstone is going to want to see these results immediately. This kind of breakthrough could justify massive additional investment in the project, not to mention the commercial implications if we can bring this technology to market. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself experiencing a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The positive response to his work was gratifying, but it also represented a level of responsibility and expectation that was entirely new to him. His theoretical explorations in the greenhouse had been purely personal pursuits, with no consequences beyond his own intellectual satisfaction. Now his insights were being evaluated for their potential impact on corporate strategy, investment decisions, and ultimately the lives of people who might benefit from improved energy technology. Dr. Martinez spent considerable time questioning Marcus about his methodology, trying to understand how he had arrived at insights that had eluded the original research team despite their advanced credentials and extensive resources. His explanations revealed an approach to problem-solving that was fundamentally different from the systematic methodologies taught in graduate schools and employed in professional research environments. "You seem to start with physical intuition rather than mathematical formalism," she observed. "Most researchers begin with established theoretical frameworks and then test how well they apply to specific situations. You appear to be working in the opposite direction, starting with observations about how physical systems actually behave and then developing mathematical descriptions that capture those behaviors." Marcus considered this characterization carefully. "I think that's accurate. When I'm working on a problem, I try to visualize what's actually happening at the most fundamental level. How are energy and matter interacting? What forces are in play? How do those interactions change under different conditions? Once I have a clear mental picture of the physical processes, the mathematics usually follows naturally." That approach requires a level of physical intuition that's quite rare, Dr. Martinez said. "Most physicists, myself included, have learned to rely heavily on mathematical tools because they provide reliable methods for handling complex systems that are difficult to visualize or understand intuitively. But there's also a cost to that approach. Sometimes the mathematical formalism can obscure rather than illuminate the underlying physics." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Victor Blackstone, who had come to check on Marcus's progress during his first day at the research facility. Dr. Martinez quickly briefed him on the theoretical breakthrough and the simulation results that suggested a path towards solving the energy transmission efficiency problem. Victor listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own sophisticated understanding of both the technical issues and their commercial implications. His responses confirmed Marcus's impression that the billionaire was not simply a financier who happened to invest in technology companies, but someone who possessed genuine expertise in the fields where his companies operated. "Dr. Martinez tells me that your approach to this problem is quite different from conventional research methods," Victor said to Marcus. "Can you walk me through your thinking process? Help me understand how you identified insights that our team missed despite 2 years of intensive work?" Marcus returned to the whiteboard and began explaining his analysis, starting with his observation about electromagnetic environmental interactions and working through the logical chain that had led him to propose adaptive field control as a solution. Victor followed the presentation carefully, occasionally asking for clarification about specific technical points or requesting additional detail about the practical implementation challenges. "What strikes me most about your approach," Victor said when Marcus finished his explanation, "is how you've reframed the problem itself. Our research team was focused on optimizing a system that they assumed would operate in isolation. You recognized that the system would actually be operating within a complex environment and that optimizing its performance required understanding and adapting to that environment." He paused, studying the equations and diagrams that covered the whiteboard. That kind of systems thinking, the ability to see how individual components fit into larger contexts, is exactly the type of insight that creates breakthrough innovations rather than incremental improvements. The three of them spent the remainder of the afternoon discussing the steps that would be required to move from theoretical insight to practical implementation, building prototype systems, conducting field tests, developing the control software that would enable real-time adaptation to environmental conditions, securing regulatory approvals for a fundamentally new approach to energy transmission. The list of tasks was extensive, but Victor seemed energized rather than daunted by the scope of the challenge. "Marcus," he said, as the meeting drew to a close, "you've accomplished something remarkable in your first day here. Not just solving a technical problem that was blocking an important project, but demonstrating an approach to innovation that could be applied to many other challenges we're working on." Victor walked to the window that overlooked the Manhattan skyline, his expression thoughtful. "I want to propose expanding our arrangement beyond the one-week trial we originally discussed. Based on what I've seen today, I believe you could make significant contributions to multiple research projects, not just the energy transmission work." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he recognized that this moment represented a potential turning point in his life. The offer Victor was about to make would likely involve commitments and opportunities far beyond anything he had imagined when he first accepted the trial week arrangement. "What I'm proposing," Victor continued, "is a formal research position with significant autonomy and resources. You would have your own laboratory, a team of support staff, and the freedom to pursue whatever projects interest you most. In exchange, we would ask for the right of first refusal on any commercial applications that emerge from your work, along with your commitment to focus your efforts on problems that align with our company's strategic objectives." The offer was generous beyond anything Marcus could have anticipated, but it also represented a fundamental change in his relationship with learning and discovery. Instead of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, driven by personal curiosity and intellectual passion, he would be working within a corporate structure with commercial objectives and competitive pressures. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackstone," Marcus said carefully, "and I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities. But I need some time to consider the implications of such a significant commitment. This morning, I was a gardener's son with an unusual hobby. Tonight, I'm being offered the opportunity to become a professional researcher with responsibilities that could affect your company's success and potentially impact millions of people." Victor nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thoughtful response I hope to hear. Anyone who would make such a major life decision without careful consideration wouldn't be the kind of person I want to work with long-term." He reached into his jacket and withdrew another business card, this one different from the first. "This has my direct phone number. When you're ready to discuss the details of a formal arrangement, call me directly. Take whatever time you need to think through the implications and discuss the opportunity with people whose judgment you trust." As Marcus prepared to leave the Blackstone Industries building at the end of his first day, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of having solved a complex technical problem, but also the awareness that his life was now poised on the edge of transformation. The quiet existence he had shared with his father, the solitary hours of study in the greenhouse, the simple routine of garden maintenance and theoretical exploration, all of that was about to change in ways he was only beginning to understand. The subway ride back to Queens gave him time to process the events of the day and begin thinking through the decision he would need to make about Victor's expanded offer. Around him, the evening commuters looked tired but satisfied. People heading home after another day of work that provided both income and identity. Marcus wondered what it would be like to join their ranks, to become someone whose primary occupation was the application of intellectual abilities to commercially significant problems. When he arrived at the small apartment above Chen's Flowers, he found his father preparing dinner while listening to classical music on their ancient radio. The familiar scene provided a comforting contrast to the high-tech environment he had been immersed in throughout the day. Here were the simple pleasures and quiet satisfactions that had sustained him through years of struggle and uncertainty. "How was your first day in the world of professional research?" David asked, noting immediately the mixture of excitement and contemplation in his son's expression. Marcus spent the next hour describing his experiences at the Blackstone Industries research facility, the technical challenge he had been given, and the breakthrough insights that had emerged from his analysis. His father listened with the same careful attention he had always brought to Marcus's enthusiastic reports about theoretical discoveries and mathematical insights. "It sounds as though your abilities were well suited to this type of applied research," David said when Marcus finished his account. "But I sense that something about the experience has left you feeling unsettled as well as excited." Marcus nodded, appreciating his father's ability to perceive the emotional complexity beneath his positive report about the day's activities. "Mr. Blackstone has offered me a permanent research position with substantial resources and autonomy. It's an incredible opportunity, one that could provide financial security and intellectual stimulation, far beyond anything I could achieve working independently." He paused, trying to articulate the source of his ambivalence. But accepting such a position would also mean committing to work within a corporate structure with objectives and priorities that I don't control. My research would need to serve the company's strategic interests rather than following wherever my curiosity leads. David continued preparing dinner while considering his son's dilemma. "The tension you're describing is one that many people face when transitioning from academic or independent work to corporate environments. The question is whether the resources and opportunities available within the corporate structure compensate for the constraints and obligations that come with them." The older man set aside his cooking preparations and joined Marcus at the small table that served as both workspace and dining area. "But there's another dimension to consider as well. The work you did today, solving problems that could affect energy distribution for millions of people, represents a different kind of contribution than the purely theoretical explorations you've been pursuing in the greenhouse." Marcus looked up with interest, sensing that his father was leading toward an insight that hadn't occurred to him. "Your theoretical work has been valuable for your own intellectual development," David continued, "but it has also been essentially private. The insights you've gained, the problems you've solved, the understanding you've developed, all of that has remained locked within your own mind. Working with Mr. Blackstone would provide opportunities to translate your abilities into practical benefits for other people." This perspective reframed the decision in terms that Marcus hadn't fully considered. The choice wasn't simply between intellectual freedom and commercial constraint, but between private exploration and public contribution. The resources Victor was offering weren't just tools for more sophisticated research, but pathways for transforming theoretical understanding into practical applications that could improve people's lives. They continued their discussion through dinner and into the evening, exploring the implications of the offer from multiple perspectives. David shared additional insights from his own experience transitioning between different professional environments, emphasizing the importance of maintaining personal integrity and core values, regardless of external circumstances. "Whatever you decide," he said finally, "remember that your worth as a person is not determined by your professional achievements or the recognition you receive from others. You are valuable because of who you are, not because of what you can do or how others perceive your abilities." As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he felt the weight of the decision he would need to make about his future. The opportunity Victor had presented was extraordinary, but it was also fundamentally different from anything he had previously experienced or imagined. Tomorrow, he would return to the Blackstone Industries research facility for the second day of his trial week, continuing to explore the capabilities and constraints of working within a professional research environment. But already, he could sense that the quiet life he had known was ending, replaced by something more complex and potentially more significant. The question that remained was whether he was ready to embrace that transformation and all the responsibilities it would entail. 3 years later, Marcus Chen stood before the United Nations General Assembly, no longer the invisible gardener's son, but a pioneer whose innovations had transformed energy access for over 50 million people across 4 continents. The partnership with Victor Blackstone had evolved far beyond their original agreement, creating a global network of research centers that recruited brilliant minds from forgotten communities and developed technologies specifically designed to serve the world's most underserved populations. The electromagnetic field adaptation systems that Marcus had first sketched on greenhouse glass now powered rural villages in Kenya, provided clean electricity to remote communities in the Amazon, and enabled disaster relief operations to establish emergency power grids within hours of arriving in crisis zones. But the technology itself was only part of the story. More important was the model they had created for identifying and nurturing exceptional talent wherever it might be found. The Blackstone Chen initiative had discovered 17-year-old Maria Santos working on quantum computing algorithms while cleaning offices in São Paulo, identified Jamal Williams developing advanced materials science while repairing electronics in Detroit, found Priya Patel solving complex mathematical proofs while tending her family's farm in rural India. Each discovery led to new innovations, new solutions to problems that had seemed intractable when addressed only by traditional research institutions. Victor watched from the audience as Marcus delivered his address, remembering the frightened teenager he had found in the greenhouse that night. The transformation was remarkable, but what impressed Victor most was how Marcus had maintained his core values even as his circumstances had changed dramatically. Success hadn't made him forget where he came from, or the communities that had shaped his understanding of what innovation should accomplish. "We stand at a crossroads," Marcus told the assembled delegates, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to speak truth to power. "We can continue to concentrate our greatest technological resources on serving populations that already have access to advanced innovations, or we can choose to direct those resources towards solving the challenges faced by the billions of people who have been systematically excluded from the benefits of human progress." David Chen watched his son from the family section, tears streaming down his weathered face. The quiet boy who had once worked equations in secret had become a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. The partnership with Victor had provided resources and opportunities, but it was Marcus's unwavering commitment to using those opportunities in service of others that had created real change. After the speech, Marcus found his way to a small garden behind the UN building, seeking a few moments of quiet reflection. Victor joined him there, both men contemplating the journey that had brought them from a chance encounter in a greenhouse to a moment when they could address the entire world about the possibilities that emerged when exceptional talent was recognized and nurtured regardless of its origin. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't taken that walk 3 years ago?" Victor asked. Marcus smiled, touching the leaves of a small tree that reminded him of the plants his father had tended so carefully. "I think about it sometimes. But I've learned that when people are truly committed to making a difference, they find ways to make it happen, regardless of the obstacles they face." He looked up at the sky, where stars were becoming visible despite the city lights. "The greenhouse taught me that beautiful things can grow in forgotten places, that innovation doesn't require permission from institutions or validation from authorities. It just requires curiosity, persistence, and the courage to believe that your ideas might actually matter. The two men stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights of New York City stretch toward the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand their work, new brilliant minds to discover and nurture. But tonight, in a small garden where unexpected partnerships had blossomed into global change, they could simply appreciate how far they had traveled from that first meeting in an abandoned greenhouse, where a young man's genius had finally been recognized by someone who understood its true value. The story of Marcus Chen and Victor Blackstone had become more than just a tale of individual success. It had become proof that when we look beyond conventional expectations and create opportunities for exceptional talent wherever it might be, we don't just change individual lives, we change the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.